Hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this event concerning the illegal Israeli military recruiting happening in Canada. My name is Rachel Small. I'm the Canada organizer with World Beyond War. It's my pleasure to welcome you all here tonight. World Beyond War is a global grassroots network of volunteers, activists, allied organizations in 189 countries advocating for the abolition of war and its replacement with a just and sustainable peace. Thank you for joining. I'm thrilled tonight to be in the company of audience members and speakers from across Canada and around the world. This webinar is hosted by Just Peace Advocates, Palestinian and Jewish Unity, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, World Beyond War, and is also endorsed by an additional 50 organizations from across Canada and around the world. Canada Files and Spring Mag are our media sponsors, and we want to thank all of these organizations and all of you here tonight so much for your support. We are live streaming right now to the Just Peace Advocates Facebook page. For those who didn't register in time, or if you'd like to share the webinar with others afterwards, please direct them there. We are using the hashtag #NoCanadians4IDF to talk about this event and this campaign. And this information will also be shared in the chat of the Zoom and on the live stream as well, so you can follow along with this conversation and join in this campaign. I'm speaking with you all now from Tikaranto on Dish with One Spoon and Treaty 13 Indigenous Territory. Given the theme of tonight's event, I would be remiss not to start off by highlighting that the foundational war of this country, Canada, is of course one of colonization, and that this violence continues to this day and is deeply relevant to our discussion tonight, so much of which concerns ongoing colonial violence in Palestine, including Canada's multifaceted role in this. World Beyond War is opposed to the promotion and glorification of any military and is of the position that there should be no ongoing military recruitment whatsoever, but least of all on behalf of an army currently overseeing a brutal occupation and that continues to kill Palestinians on a regular basis. This issue is very personal to me because as a young child, I remember the ways in which both the Canadian military as well as the IDF, Israeli Defense Force, were glorified to me. The Canadian military as a peacekeeper, as a gently benevolent force, and the IDF as the defender of the only place where I was told that I could truly be safe as a Jewish person. My family, like so many Jewish families, lost many members in the Holocaust and suffered as a result of deep-seated anti-Semitism in Canada and all over the world. As I began to learn more about the colonial military violence at Kanesatake, the famous Oka crisis that took place right near my home of Montreal when I was a young child, as well as I began to learn about the colonial military violence happening often in my name as a Jewish person in Palestine, I began to understand how much I was misled about the violence carried out by military forces, ostensibly on my behalf. That's some of my connection to this issue and why I'm so thrilled to be moderating this important event tonight. Some of our panelists will dig into that broader context surrounding the core focus of our event tonight, which is of course looking at the Israeli military recruitment that has been uncovered within Canada. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight. And I'll just start before I introduce our first panelist by being very clear about something that not everyone might be aware of, which is that it is indeed a crime in Canada to recruit anyone for a foreign military. It's also a crime to aid and abet such recruitment by offering incentives and encouraging any person to serve in a foreign military. And the Foreign Enlistment Act states this very clearly, as our panelists will discuss throughout tonight. This webinar is part of a campaign that was launched in the fall with a formal complaint and a public letter signed by Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters, various former MPs, etc., asking Justice Minister David Lametti to investigate the recruitment taking place in Canada for the Israel Defense Forces. It has received broad media coverage and public support. To this day, over 2,000 letters have been sent to Minister Lametti, over 700 letters to the RCMP commissioner. So that's the part of the campaign that brings us to where we are tonight. We have a number of excellent speakers. I'll be giving each the floor for a presentation, after which we will open it up to questions from the audience. To tell you the order of the night, first we'll be hearing from Rabbi David Mivasair, representative of Independent Jewish Voices. He will help set the scene for us, explain some of the context. Next, we'll be listening to a fascinating presentation on video by Aseel Bajeh, Legal Research and Advocacy Officer with Al-Haq in Palestine. She'll be providing some of the bigger picture of the war crimes committed against the Palestinian people, as well as outlining Canada's obligations under international law. Then Ruba Ghazal, member of the National Assemblée of Quebec, will share her and her party's perspective on how the Trudeau government should act. And finally, John Philpot, attorney of international law and international courts, will provide an overview of the Canadian law, in particular the Foreign Enlistment Act. And then after all that, it'll be followed by questions from the audience. As you have questions occur to you, please do type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. And unfortunately, I regret to inform you all that MP Mario Beaulieu has backed out of this event at the last minute due to a scheduling conflict. So unfortunately, he will not be speaking tonight. As I mentioned earlier, for those joining a bit late, tonight's webinar has translation available in English and French. Please choose your language at the bottom of the screen, button marked interpretation. Thank you to our interpreters, Antonio and Peter, for your work tonight. Encore une fois, comme j'ai mentionné il y a quelques minutes, chaque personne doit lui-même sélectionner si vous voulez écouter.
Again, as we said just a moment ago, you have to choose the language you wish to hear the interpretation in. So you click on the globe icon at the bottom of the screen that says interpretation. And if you want English, then you click English.
Speak slowly to allow for the best possible translation in both languages. So now, finally, without further delay, it is my true pleasure to introduce Rabbi David Mivasair. David lives in Hamilton, Ontario, and is active in supporting Palestinian struggle for freedom, justice, and equality through Independent Jewish Voices in Canada and Jewish Voice for Peace in the United States. He lived in Israel for 4 years, has returned several times to engage in on-the-ground co-resistance with Palestinians and Israeli Jews. For more than 20 years, he has served as the rabbi of 3 different synagogues in the US and in Vancouver. Rabbi David is now retired and devotes his time and energy to the biblical commandment to seek peace and pursue it. So I'm thrilled to pass the mic to him to get us started tonight. Welcome, David.
So thank you, Rachel, for the welcome and for the introduction to the entire topic. And especially thank you to everyone else who's here to listen, to learn, and to share our thoughts about what's going on here in Canada. And I really want to start by saying Shalom Aleichem, peace to everyone, peace to all of us. And I also just want to start by saying Yehiyu leratzon im refi v'higayon libi. May everything that comes out of my mouth, everything in my heart be acceptable. I'm going to do my best to share my truth. And I'd like to start off perhaps, as Rachel just said, with the idea of seeking peace and pursuing it. In the Jewish religion, we say there's 613 commandments. You know, we read the Torah, it's full of ideas about what God wants us to do as human beings in this world. We say there's 613 different commandments, everything from keeping the Sabbath to honoring our mother and father. Of those 613, there are 2 that use the word seek and pursue, meaning don't sit back and wait for the opportunity to come along, but get up out of your place of comfort and go and do it. Make it happen. So one of those is seek peace and pursue it. The other one is justice. Justice you shall pursue. That's the kind of Judaism that I wanted my children to be educated in. So when my kids were little, I can say, thank God now, more than 30 years ago, my wife and I enrolled them in Jewish schools where we lived in Vancouver. It was really pretty nice. You know, they learned about Jewish holidays, they learned some Hebrew, they learned the Bible. But another part of what went on in the schools was they learned a lot about Israel, which also actually was pretty nice. I was very attracted to Israel. I lived there for different years of my life. It's a part of Jewish life. It's a part for most Jews, I think, of what we think of as being Jewish. It's like our ancestral homeland. It's the setting of our Bible stories. It's in our prayers. Those of us who are religious, we pray about Israel many times every day, even after every meal we eat. So Israel is part of our life. They learned about that. That was great. Part of that learning was learning about the Israeli military, the Israeli army. Israeli soldiers actually came and spoke in their schools. They learned about battles. They learned about the bravery, the heroism, the valor of Israeli soldiers. They learned about how the military defends the Jews. And this went on year after year, right through high school. In most Jewish schools in Canada, there are members of the Israeli military who serve on the faculty. They're called Chayalot Morot. They're usually, I'll say, young women from Israel. They finished high school, and like most young Israelis, they're subjected to compulsory military service. They enlisted in their military, and their military duty actually was to go out to the diaspora and teach in Jewish schools to build a bond between Jews around the world and Israel. That's actually part of Jewish life. So we actually have Israeli military personnel teaching in our schools for our kids. I kind of wondered about this. It didn't exactly sit right with me. As the years went by, and I learned more and more about what the Israeli military actually does on a daily basis, all over Palestine, which isn't only the West Bank, it isn't only Gaza, it's actually that whole place, that place that for me, for years and years and years, was Israel, is also, of course, Palestine. So as I learned what the Israeli military does there on a daily basis, smashing into people's homes virtually every night, dragging children out of their beds, standing them up outside, sometimes arresting them, taking them away in the middle of the night, running roadblocks virtually everywhere so that people can't even travel like from one village or one town to another, arresting people arbitrarily, using violence, actually preventing Palestinian farmers and shepherds from protecting themselves against settler violence. And the list goes on and on and on. And I'm talking about everyday levels of violence. The more I learned about that, the more I thought, this does not belong in our schools that are supported by our Jewish community. It shouldn't be part of the education that we're giving our kids. If at all, we need to give them a more complex and more nuanced and maybe more troubling understanding of what's going on to actually equip them to understand what's happening. So the effect of all this kind of glorification and romanticization of the military is that by the time they graduate, or if they go to university, by the time they graduate university, there are quite a few Canadian Jewish young people who think the way they can serve the Jewish people is go to Israel and enlist in the military. And dozens do every year. They have a kind of romantic image of what it is. But it turns out that it really isn't this bright, happy, defend the Jews kind of experience. The leading, I mean, not even thinking, what are they doing to Palestinians? Just thinking of their own experience. The actual leading cause of death for Israeli soldiers last year was suicide. In 2019, 3 foreign recruits committed suicide. None of this is talked about within our Jewish education system. So I think it's time for us in the Jewish community to think clearly and to be honest with ourselves, to have a kind of what we call a cheshbon nefesh, to look at what we're doing, to evaluate, is this what we want going on in our schools, supported by our Jewish organizations? You know, that's one side of it. Then, because of this project right now, I learned, like, actually to my surprise, that it's illegal in Canada to entice any person to enlist in a foreign military. So considering that it's illegal, how can it go on? It just goes on with complete impunity. And that, I think, is a political question. The truth is that the mainstream organizations of the Jewish community over decades have been able to build up enough influence in the Canadian government so that these kinds of activities just have complete impunity. They're not questioned, they're not talked about. It's somewhat similar to the Jewish National Fund being a charitable organization and people being able to deduct from their taxes donations to the Jewish National Fund, which uses its money to buy land and build facilities in Israel, Palestine, which are for Jews. It's discriminatory, it supports settlement activities. It's illegal, but it goes on despite complaints, despite years and years of complaints backed up by solid evidence coming from that organization's own documentation. So similarly, there's a kind of impunity that these programs that clearly entice young people to enlist in a foreign military are just allowed to go on without being questioned, without being examined, and that's what we hope to change. And I think for now, I'll just leave it there. I'll be open to the questions or discussion later on. But again, I thank everyone for your interest and thank you for joining us, and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi David, for really diving into the context within Jewish communities of this discussion and of recruitment to the IDF, and for that powerful call for us to do the real work in our institutions and in our communities, and to not just wait for things to change. Next up, I'm so pleased that we'll be hearing from Aseel Bajeh, a legal researcher and advocacy officer at Al-Haq, Palestinian human rights organization. She holds an LLM in international human rights law from the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway. And in addition to her academic research, which focused on transitional justice and decolonization in Palestine, Aseel writes opinion articles for several media outlets, including the Electronic Intifada, Al Jazeera blogs, and the New Arab. Because it is, I think, 2 a.m. in Palestine right now, Aseel pre-recorded her presentation. And Jonathan Katab, the founder of Al-Haq, will be available with other panelist members afterwards to answer questions in relation to Aseel's presentation. So I want to thank Aseel again for recording this presentation and sharing it with us tonight. And we'll begin presenting it to you right now.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very glad to be joining this webinar, and apologies for not being at least virtually present live with you in this webinar, but this is due to time issues. So I will be presenting on war crimes committed by the Israeli military in Palestine and how these crimes are ongoing in their nature. Part of the war crimes that I'm going to focus on are the forcible transfer of the Palestinian population, also the war crime of the transfer of the Israeli civilian population into the occupied territory, the crime of extensive destruction and appropriation of property, and the crime of willful killing. But before I go into detail into these crimes, I want to shed light on an issue that is really important in our situation, which is the words that we use to describe a phenomena and how often they determine the way we address and understand the issue, right? So we often refer to the Israeli military as defense forces. And this is a part of the narrative that revolves around Palestine these days, which characterizes the situation as an Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which basically means that there are two parties with opposing interests and that each party has legitimate and equal rights, including the right to defend itself. My argument is that we should be moving to another paradigm, which is the anti-colonial struggle, whereby we should be understanding that the Israeli acts are not defensive, including the Israeli military acts, and also in order to understand, to arrive at this conclusion, we need to go back to the history and to the root causes of the problem. So if we go back to 1948, when the Israeli state was established, we should be understanding that this state was established as a culmination of the Zionist settler colonial movement, and that the Israeli state continued with the same ideology, the Zionist settler colonial ideology, which aims at transferring the indigenous Palestinian population and replacing them with a settler population. Now, when we look at the crimes that were committed before and after, we see how similar or how the same they are, the war crimes. And we should understand that when Israel was established and it established its military forces, or the so-called defense forces, it merged the Zionist forces that had committed previous crimes before into the military. And examples of the crimes that were committed by the Zionist forces include the transfer of 75% of the indigenous Palestinian population, the commitment of at least 31 major massacres, the destruction of 531 Palestinian villages and towns. Now, all these constitute war crimes that were committed by Zionist forces, and they continue to be perpetrated today by the Israeli military forces. This is what Palestinians refer to as the Nakba, where they were displaced and dispossessed in 1948. And in fact, we do also refer to this as the ongoing Nakba, which continues to be perpetrated through Israel's denial of the Palestinian from exercising their right to self-determination, including their right to return to their original places, and the ongoing policies of forcible transfer. Now, if we fast forward to 1967, as if you see in the third map, Israel occupies the West Bank in green, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. And this occupation continues up until this day. I want to focus on 3 villages that were occupied in 1967. These villages were completely destructed by the Israeli military forces. Of course, this constitutes a war crime. Now, why I'm focusing on this is that the Palestinians who were displaced from these 3 villages that are located northwest of Jerusalem were never denied to return. And instead, we have 1973, Canada's Jewish National Fund did a campaign to raise funds for the establishment of a park on the place of the ruins of these destroyed villages. Canada's park was indeed established, and it continues to Canada's Jewish National Fund continues to raise funds toward the maintenance of this park. And this is only one example of the involvement of Canada into the commitment of war crimes in Palestine. Moving elsewhere in the occupied territory, there are 2 million Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip who have been subject to suffocating closure and blockade by the Israeli forces since 2007. Now, this blockade, of course, has resulted in profound levels of poverty, unemployment, aid dependency, and collapse of essential services. The UN in 2012 have warned that the Gaza Strip would be uninhabitable by 2020. Not only has the closure continued up until this day, and 2020 has passed, but the people of Gaza also suffered from various military offensives during the course of this blockade as well. For example, in 2014, the Israeli occupying forces killed 2,219 Palestinians, including 556 children. Of these killed, there's this infographic that shows that 56% of the Palestinians that were killed during this offensive were refugees. And it shows the places that they were displaced from. And this will make me move to my next point, which is the Great March of Return in 2018, also in the Gaza Strip, where it's very good to mention that 70% of the population in the Gaza are refugees since 1948, and they have been denied to return to their homes ever since, and enclosed in the Gaza Strip by the Israeli policy of closure. Now, what happened in 2018 is that the people of Gaza protested and marched to protest their right to return, and of course to end the Israeli closure and occupation against them. The unfortunate thing is that the Israeli occupation forces, whenever the Palestinian demand that the oppression is remedied against them, the Israeli forces also use the lethal force and excessive use of force against them. During this Great March of Return, 216 Palestinian protesters, peaceful protesters, were killed by the Israeli occupation forces, including journalists and health workers and persons with disabilities. 47 of these killed during the march were children, and there is also the injury of 6,000 Palestinian protesters with live ammunition by the Israeli army. And this is a very unfortunate, but like a story that should make us understand that Israel criminalizes Palestinians' civil and political rights, even if it's nonviolent, as supposed threat to its security, right? And that whenever these Palestinian calls that the ongoing settler colonialism is ended, the Israeli use the excessive use of force. Here I want to quote scholar Noor Ariqat, who says that if we fail to understand that the Palestinian people are demanding that the root causes of their oppression be ended, and that they have the right to recourse even to the use of force against the Israeli colonial domination, then we are risking creating a new body of law which intends to protect a power's colonial holding, as it gives the impression that Israel is using force to defend itself, when in fact it is using force to squash Palestinian claims. On a final note on the war crimes committed by the Israeli military and the Israeli authorities in general, the crime of forcible transfer is at the core of the settler colonial Israeli regime, right? And this crime is committed in various forms. It doesn't have to be direct. In fact, in international law, the war crime of forcible transfer can be committed in coercive ways. And if we look at the policies and actions committed by Israel in the occupied territory, including in East Jerusalem, we see various of policies and actions that aim at driving the Palestinians from their land. And examples from these policies are, of course, the settlement, construction, and expansion. There are currently 250 illegal settlements in the occupied territory where Israeli settlers reside. These settlement construction is accompanied by also another measures such as the annexation wall, the exploitation of the natural resources of the occupied people, freedom of movement restriction, systematic house demolition. Like, for example, just since the spread of COVID-19 from March to the 1st of January 21, the Israeli occupying forces demolished 470 Palestinian structures, including 211 houses, resulting in the displacement of 811 Palestinians, including 382 children. Now, as a final note, the issue of war crimes is related to the concept of individual criminal responsibility, which means that individuals, including people in the Israeli military, can be prosecuted at the International Criminal Court, which is basically the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in December 2019 has concluded the preliminary examination of the situation of Palestine at the court and believes that war crimes happened and are being committed in Palestine. But the formal investigation has not yet been opened. But of course, Canada, by recruiting its nationals into the Israeli military, it's violating its obligations under international law, because the serious crimes committed by Israel entails obligation on all states of the international community, first of all, not to recognize the illegal situation created by Israel's violation, not to aid and assist in maintaining the situation created by the violation, and to cooperate to bring an end these serious breaches, and also to ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions. Now, if we want to translate these international law obligations into actions, then Canada should be, for example, supporting the investigation done by the International Criminal Court in order to prosecute those held, those responsible for the commitment of war crimes. It can also, as in line of its obligation to cooperate to bring an end to serious breaches, it can cooperate with the international community to implement countermeasures, including stopping military aid and cooperation with the Israeli army, and of course, ending the recruitment of Canadian nationals in the Israeli army. Thank you.
I want to thank Aseel so much for really succinctly and in depth laying out the bigger picture of these war crimes that have been and continue to be committed against the Palestinian people by Israeli authorities, and really stressing Canada's obligations under international law in relation to these serious crimes that are committed by an occupying force. So thank you to Aseel, and thank you as well to Jonathan Katab, who, as I mentioned earlier, will be available afterwards to answer questions alongside the other panelists. Next, we'll be hearing from Ruba Ghazal, a founding member of Quebec Solidaire and the elected member to the Quebec National Assembly for the riding of Mercier. Since her election, she has been the Quebec Solidaire spokesperson for the environment, transport, energy, and science. She was born in Beirut into a Palestinian family and arrived in Quebec at the age of 10 after growing up in the Persian Gulf. She pre-recorded a message to share with us now. She's speaking in French, and English subtitles have been added to the video, so it will not be interpreted, but we would invite English speakers to note the subtitles. We'll now share Ruba's commentary.
Bonsoir, mon nom est Ruba Ghazal, je suis députée de Mercier pour Québec solidaire. Je vous remercie de me donner l'occasion de vous adresser la parole à travers cet enregistrement. J'aurais aimé être parmi vous ce soir, mais malheureusement, mon emploi du temps m'en empêche. Et je voulais répondre à l'invitation de Bruce pour donc vous parler. Je veux joindre ma voix aux centaines de personnes, des profs d'université, des militants de défense des droits des Palestiniens, des représentants syndicaux, etc., qui ont demandé au ministre fédéral de la Justice à ce que le gouvernement du Canada mène une enquête sur les allégations d'agissements illégaux, de recrutement militaire de la part du consulat d'Israël pour le compte de l'État d'Israël. Le ministre n'a pas à référer à la police. Il peut très bien lui-même agir pour mener cette enquête parce que la loi canadienne est claire. Pour le recrutement militaire pour le compte de notre pays, eh bien, c'est interdit. C'est interdit pour Israël comme c'est interdit pour n'importe quel État dans le monde. Donc, il n'y a aucune raison pour que le gouvernement du Canada, le gouvernement de Justin Trudeau n'agisse pas et mène cette enquête. On ne veut pas que le Canada, encore moins que le Québec, devienne la cour arrière au recrutement militaire pour le compte de l'État d'Israël. Je vais en profiter pour vous faire part aussi de certaines prises de position que j'ai faites au nom de Québec solidaire dans l'espace public, sur mes réseaux sociaux, à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec pour la question palestinienne. Vous savez, c'est une question qui me tient beaucoup à cœur parce que je suis moi-même d'origine palestinienne. Ma famille est réfugiée palestinienne depuis 1948 et donc je sens une responsabilité pour faire connaître tout ce que le peuple palestinien vit aujourd'hui, le bafouement de ses droits fondamentaux. C'est un combat universel et je veux le faire et je veux prendre la parole comme digne successeur de Amir Kadir. Amir qui n'a jamais mâché ses mots quand il était député, encore aujourd'hui, lorsqu'il s'agit de dénoncer les manquements aux droits de la personne de l'État d'Israël, comme de n'importe quel autre État. Tous les États peuvent être critiquables et le Canada aussi. J'ai d'ailleurs pris position durant la campagne contre la candidature du Canada pour un siège au Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU. Et finalement, sa candidature a été rejetée. Donc, la campagne a donné des bons résultats. C'est une bonne chose parce que contrairement à ce que dit le gouvernement de Justin Trudeau, que c'est un pays pacifique, etc., le Canada fait partie, ça c'est un fait, des plus grands exportateurs d'armes dans le monde. Et c'est pas vrai que en vendant des armes à un pays comme l'Arabie saoudite, que la sécurité internationale va être bien gardée. Donc, on le voit, le gouvernement de Justin Trudeau ne fait que continuer la politique de Stephen Harper avant lui en votant aux côtés de l'État d'Israël et des États-Unis contre des résolutions qui défendent les droits des peuples palestiniens, alors que la très grande majorité des États membres votent pour ces résolutions-là. Et donc, c'est une honte que le Canada fasse ça et il ne mérite pas ce siège-là tant et aussi longtemps qu'il ne change pas sa politique. J'ai aussi, à une autre occasion, pris la parole à l'Assemblée nationale du Québec lors d'une déclaration de député où j'ai dénoncé le plan de paix de Trump et j'espère et j'ai très hâte que la nouvelle administration de Joe Biden renie ce plan et le mette aux poubelles de l'histoire comme le rapport Durham qui a fait tant mal dans l'histoire aux Québécois. Donc, j'espère que le gouvernement, l'administration de Joe Biden va redéménager l'ambassade d'Israël là où elle devrait être, c'est-à-dire à Tel Aviv, parce que ce plan-là, les Palestiniens n'ont jamais été consultés, ils ne l'ont jamais appuyé et dans le fond, c'est une manœuvre pour annexer leur territoire. Donc voilà, je vais continuer avec vous à mener ce combat pour le droit des peuples palestiniens, à faire connaître leur juste cause auprès de tout le monde et à continuer à critiquer l'État d'Israël, à critiquer le Canada lorsque cela est mérité. Donc, je vous souhaite une très, très bonne soirée et je vous remercie. À la prochaine. Au revoir.
Alors, je veux remercier Ruba Ghazal. I would like to thank Ruba for sharing her words tonight, for being a powerful voice championing for justice in Quebec right now, and sharing her and her party's perspective on how the Trudeau government should act, and really the hypocrisy between their stated foreign policy and then what is in fact happening. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce John Philpot, an experienced international defense attorney before many international criminal courts and in Canada. He's been active in Africa, Latin America, and Europe, as well as here. He's a member of the International Criminal Court Bar Association since its inception, as well as of the coordinating committee of the Coalition BDS de Québec, the BDS Coalition of Quebec, and president of the Rwandan Political Prisoners Support Network. There's more that I could say, but for now, I'm thrilled to hand the mic over to John. Thank you.
Well, thank you to all the organizers. And I will try and make this quite simple. And one word which keeps coming back and back is the word peace. And we have to fight for peace, but not just any peace, a just peace. Now, the illegality of the recruiting in Canada is defined by Article 11 of the Foreign Enlistment Act, which says basically you can't recruit in Canada. There's a minor exception. A country can recruit its own citizens who are not Canadians. Now, this comes from the Spanish Civil War, 1938-37, Mackenzie King, but that's not the issue today. What's happening now? Well, consular officers in Toronto, we have the web references, invite people to join the army. Consular officers can be charged under criminally, and they should be, black and white. Ambassadors who are probably involved cannot be charged, basically can't be charged. They can be removed. Local organizations which invite soldiers to speak about joining the army, the Israel Occupation Force, thank you for the term, they can be charged because they're helping. You cannot help someone commit a crime. I cannot help someone to rob a bank, giving him advice. That's the same crime. We have the United UJA of Greater Toronto, which last year on the 4th of June publicized a webinar on how to join the Israeli army, and the corresponding organization in Montreal did that, I think, on the 7th or 8th of June. These, on face value anyway, look like crimes. The Canadian ambassador to Israel, former Deborah Lyons, on January 16th, just over a year ago, held a big celebration celebrating Canadians in the, I'll use the word IDF. She is inciting it. I think she probably is, and I think she should be charged because she has no immunity. Mr. Lametti said, well, no, it's not my responsibility, and Ruba Ghazal was very clear. He has to push and make sure this is investigated properly. And imagine if it was a Muslim organization, he would go crazy. So Canada's government is deficient on this. We wrote to the RCMP on the 3rd of November. And again, we gave more evidence on the 3rd of January. They promised to tell us that what's happening with their investigation. We have no news. What's the legal problem of our Canadian kids, young guys, and women? Well, they enforce the occupation, which you've heard about, an illegal occupation. Our estimates are there's somewhere between 250 and 700 Canadians in this, working in this army. And just last week, or just earlier this week, we heard about a British lone soldier. These are soldiers from abroad, more or less, killed a young Palestinian. We've just seen it. So this is what Canadians are, young Canadians are going to do, and Canada has to stop this. This army enforces the apartheid system. It enforces the occupation. This army commits the crime of aggression against its neighbors. There's a long history of Israel in being involved. In the last 8 years, it's been involved in Syria. They bombed Deir el-Zor last week, and so they're committing the crime of aggression. And this big secret everybody knows about is they have nuclear arms. So Canada is letting soldiers be recruited by a nuclear power, which can use it, by the way. What is Mr. Lametti doing? Well, on the 9th of February, there's a conference called the Rule of Law, organizing by the Canadian Jewish Association and the UJA of Toronto on the rule of law. Mr. Lametti is attending. Why should he be attending this when one of the organizing groups is being investigated, we hope? At least they've had complaints about their being involved in recruiting. Canada has a double standard, and our government has a shameful role in supporting and ignoring or helping out with the recruiting and the support for Israel. Ruba Ghazal pointed out, Canada is not a respected country in the world. Canadians think they're superior. The Canadian government, I'm not saying all Canadians, by the way, have this superiority complex. They support this blind, colonial, arrogant approach in Palestine, as they do also in Venezuela, with recognizing Juan Guaido or arresting Meng Wanzhou. Where does this lead us? Well, we have the short term and the long term. We have to advance this campaign, and there's many ways, and we can talk about this in the question and answer period, where we can put an end to this. We need more live evidence of this recruiting from people who've been recruited. We can take maybe private complaints against the government, against the recruiting in Canada. But what it comes down to for all of us, I think, is that we have to look at our government, and we have to invite our government or force our government to adopt an independent foreign policy. We have to evaluate Canadian foreign policy around the world, but in particular in Palestine, which is one of the most egregious violations and actions by Canada and Canada's voting policy. A global review of Canadian foreign policy. Here we are in Canada with this IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. Here we are fighting racism, fighting Israeli apartheid, and they're accusing us of being racist. So this leads us to the major challenge of the pro-Palestinian movement. We have to invite and force Canada to change its direction now, and this applies to all political parties in the Canadian Parliament, and we have to work with them and convince them to change the direction of Canadian policy. I will leave it at that now, and thank you very much for this organization, for the organizers, and we are able to answer questions and hopefully enlighten you about some of the issues, which are very simple. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for making that seem simple. It is complicated, and you did, that was such a helpful breakdown of some of the various factors that are going on here when we're looking at this as a legal question and also as a question of our values. We are going to open up the floor to questions. First, I'm going to invite journalist Zainab Marai to unmute and ask her question, and then we'll leave space for other media questions, followed by a number of excellent audience questions. Zainab, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you for speaking at the truth. I really appreciate it. And let me point out that it is a bit sensitive because, you know, my name is Zainab. Thank you, by the way, for pronouncing my family the right way. Well, I'm speaking from Lebanon. And unfortunately, if you're Arab or Muslim and you wish to talk about this, you might really be accused of being an anti-Semitic. Unfortunately, this is what's happening. So my question is, it's great to just reach out to more people and talk about this, make it more public. But when it comes to resisting the occupation forces, to try to defend your land, your people, if you try to resist, okay, by arms, you are going. Maybe many will call you violent. So my question is, how can we actually come to final peace? Because there's always been this talk about negotiations for peace and just reaching peace eventually, but it's not really happening. Just more people are being killed and maimed, and it's just ongoing. I mean, even when it comes to Canada, sorry, let me just stick straight to the point. So my first question is, why is resistance by arms, by military means, why is it always criminalized? I mean, if somebody attacked Canadians, let's see, on the land, won't they have the right to just fight back? I mean, Canada is arming itself, its troops. So, and they say they want to defend the land. So why can't other countries just do the same? Why, when they do that, why are they called terrorists? This is my first question. And the second question is, please, if any of the speakers can highlight the Canadian involvement in the Second Lebanon War, which in which Israel attacked Lebanon. And as far as I know, Canadians were involved. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that very thoughtful and interesting question. I'm going to first allow Jonathan Katab to answer, and then I will pass it to John Philpot, and then if Rabbi David would like to answer as well. Jonathan, please introduce yourself and if you'd like to answer this question.
Okay, my name is Jonathan Katab. I'm a Palestinian attorney, human rights activist. I'm one of the founders of the organization that's one of the organizations that's sponsoring this event. I want to emphasize one point which may partially answer the last question. The essence of human rights work and the essence of international law is that it is universal. It should be applied to friend and foe alike. These are standards that are applicable across the line all over the world. Otherwise, they lose their value. Otherwise, they just become a means to advance your own political interests. So the essence of human rights is that they are universal. And the essence of law, including Canadian law, is in its equal application to everybody. The problem is that there's a group of people who think that they should be exempt, that their situation is different, that there is a special reason why the laws that apply to everybody else should not apply in their case. Whether it's because they are victims, whether it's because they are powerful, whether it's because they were persecuted in the past, whether it's because they are influential and close to the centers of power, or whether because they're victims happen to be nasty people and they're good people. Anytime you hear somebody saying, my situation is different, I am exempt from the rule that applies to everybody else, immediately that should raise red flags. So this is, I think, the essence of what I want to say. The right to self-defense is, of course, universal. Everybody has a right, every country has a right to resort even to armed struggle. And I say this as a pacifist who doesn't believe in fighting, but that is one of the rights that is recognized under international law, the right of resistance when you are under oppression. So this should answer, I think, the last speaker, and it should also address the topic of this gathering. Canadian law that prohibits the recruitment of foreign armies on Canadian soil is a Canadian law. It should apply to everybody. It shouldn't just apply to the Chinese, the Irish, the Syrians, the Palestinians, or anybody else who tries to recruit on Canadian soil. It should also apply to Israelis. It should also apply to Americans. It should also apply to other countries that try to recruit soldiers on Canadian soil. Otherwise, it's not a law. Otherwise, it becomes, it loses its meaning.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that thoughtful answer. I'll pass it to John to answer,
Yeah.
and then David, and then we'll take an additional media question.
Mm-hmm. The question of why it's criminalized is because the people who say and call names are the powerful Western people. And Mike Pompeo keeps designating all these different people as terror organizations as terrorists arbitrarily with no foundation. And it's very important for us, and this is a debate which we're having in our work, to understand the armed resistance to Zionism. And some people in the West think, oh, to the Palestinians, you can't get arms from Iran, you can't get our arms from Hezbollah, you can't get arms from Syria, our solidarity is going to help you. That's false. South Africa was resolved basically by the force of arms, but the support of people like us in the West 30 years ago, okay, we're transposing it, is also very important. I'm in BDS, our pacifist approach, which is desirable, is also very important. But we, in the resistance, are obliged to try and understand the war in Yemen, the proxy war in Syria, which is a proxy war. It's not a popular uprising. The Iranian resistance, the assassination of Iranian scientists, the last one being the 28th of November. We have to face all that and analyze it and go against what our government is doing. When they killed Mr. Soleimani on the 3rd of January 2020, that's one of the major war crimes. Trump didn't start many wars, but he committed a lot of bad murders. So these are things, I can't get into all this now. We cannot avoid discussing these issues because I'm older. The war in Vietnam, we supported the resistance and they won in Vietnam. We will support the resistance. I promise in my humble and not very important way to support the resistance in what people call now Western Asia and not the Middle East. But anyway, so thank you very much for your question, Zainab Merai, and I maybe didn't pronounce your name right. Sanctions are also another thing. The Caesar sanctions on Syria people are killed. They don't eat. The sanctions on Iraq imposed by Madeleine Albright. These are all things that are interrelated. See my hands? They're all connected, okay? And we have to fight all that. And I know that Just Peace Advocates, I'm a member of the board, and I'm very proud to work with people like Jonathan Kettab and the other people. But this is where our work in the Palestinian solidarity and fight against colonialism, we have to take everything into consideration. Thank you.
Now I'm going to turn the mic over to Daniel from A Journalist with Canada Files to ask his question.
So this was a very insightful, I'm going to say that this was a really insightful presentation, and it's honestly shocking to see that like the people who have been calling out the IDF and the Israeli military, or should I say the Israeli occupation forces, and their supporters are literally recruiting on Canadian soil. They've quite literally, like, the RCMP hasn't even, they haven't even investigated this, and I'm wondering if like there is not just a strong like the Canadian, there's not just a strong pro-Israeli voice within the Canadian government, or like links between the Canadian government and pro-Zionist Jewish organizations, but also perhaps maybe like are there elements within the Canadian like military or the Canadian intelligence services that are allowing this to happen? Because like it's mentioned that by David that the Israeli military actually has people that are working in the Canadian schools, Jewish schools, to promote the pro-Israeli message. And I'm wondering, like, are there elements of the Canadian military or the Canadian, like, the RCMP, the Canadian lawmakers, that are specifically allowing this to slide just because of the links to Israel? It's not just simply because of the of a few ambassadors that are just letting this slide, that are taking advantage of our ties to Israel, but like there's are basically like people in the Canadian military or the intelligence agencies that are letting this happen because of our diplomatic ties with Israel.
Thank you. So on the question of sort of beyond the Canadian government involvement or a few ambassadors on other Canadian institutions, and how are they complicit in this issue, I'll flip the order this time and pass it first to Rabbi David Mivasair to give an answer to that question.
So Daniel, I don't know anything about the inside of the Canadian military or intelligence organizations, but it's clear that there's very influential political effect on the Canadian government, mostly from organized Jewish community groups. I'm thinking of a group that we call CIJA, which stands for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs. It is the Israel lobby in Canada. It's very heavily funded. It has a large staff of professional influencers. We also have people who have been MPs and ministers in the government who are devoted to defending Israel at all costs. I'm thinking right now of Erwin Kotler, who's basically created the IHRA, supposed definition of anti-Semitism in order to declare or deem that talking about Palestine human rights is anti-Semitic and must be hate speech and suppressed. I'm just saying again, Erwin Kotler was the Minister of Justice in Canada, and he's very deeply involved in the Liberal Party. Until recently, there was an MP from Toronto named Michael Levin, who actually resigned as an MP, and he went to be the head of a very, very right-wing Zionist organization called the Friends of the Simon Wiesenthal Center that uses the excuse of suppressing anti-Semitism as a way to actually suppress discussion about Palestine. So you don't really need to burrow into the Canadian military and Canadian intelligence services. And while I'm talking about I'll just say like the Zionist influence, the Jewish Zionist influence in Canada, we should also remember not many years back, we had a conservative government headed by Stephen Harper, who I believe is an evangelical Christian. And there are many, many very influential Christian evangelical Zionists who have their own reasons for supporting Israel. It has nothing to do with us Jews. They're not looking out for our welfare, but they use Israel to promote their own goals, right? So I think those are really the sources of influence on the Canadian government that give Israel the impunity to violate Canadian law right here in Canada. If your question is, why doesn't the Canadian government do something to stop Israeli military recruiting in Canada, which is clearly illegal? I think that's the answer. I don't think you have to look kind of too deeply to see that.
The RCMP is a political police which burnt barns here in 1970, which attacked the First Nations and the Métis in Western Canada. And they know, and the Canadian security knows everything. I represented some young people who were being recruited to go and fight, and they were arrested at the airport at a certain date in 2015. I won't get into details. The government knows everything about this type of thing. They just don't act. They followed all these young people and they knew where they were going. And I'm sure they know about the recruitees. The Canadian Embassy knows. They invited them to a party. Anyway.
I can add a little more to my answer. It's worth thinking about. So not only the Jewish Zionist organizations and the Christian Zionist organizations, but I think from the outset, there's a kind of a general cultural sympathy for Israel that comes from a kind of understanding of the Holocaust and from centuries and centuries of oppression of Jews. And I think there's a rather widespread kind of sympathy or support for Israel and wanting to see Jews in a positive light, and that gets transferred to Israel. And a lot of people are, I think, afraid to speak out about it. I think many people, even in the questions in this webinar right now, people are saying things like, how can we separate criticism of Israel and talking about some of the horrible things that Israel's doing from accusations of anti-Semitism? So it's more than just the specific political influence, for example, of CIJA or the Simon Wiesenthal Center or B'nai B'rith, and the Christian Zionists, but I think there's just a very broad kind of response to actually centuries of anti-Semitism, culminating in the Holocaust, that kind of gives Israel like a free pass and a very widespread feeling that people don't want to make Israel into the bad guy. So they just let it go.
Thank you. We are being overwhelmed with excellent questions. I'm going to try to move us along to some of the audience questions, and I'm going to try to group them a bit. So there's a few questions that basically concern how have we been trying to get the Canadian government to enforce the act, and have there been any positive results or signs from what has happened so far? So that's the first part. And then I think an accompanying second part that many people have asked is, if the appropriate federal authorities refuse to act and don't, let's say, file any charges, what's the best way to move forward? And one person's asking specifically about private prosecution, but it's also just a broader question about what could be next steps. So this time we'll start with John and then move to Rabbi Mivasair.
We've had reasonable media coverage in Quebec in October and then recently, and there's some awareness of our campaign. So we're making some progress. English Canada is a bit tighter. I think the media are even tighter and more controlled. And there's an automatic Radio Canada. People who don't live in, we call it Radio Cadena. It's Radio Canada doesn't give us much, you know, it's a French expression, okay? So we have to do more. A lot of people are very good in media work in our group. I am not one of them. I admire people who do it. With respect to private complaints, this is something we are considering, and we have some support from other people who are going to help us. And it's how to do it, what evidence to use. It's a legal issue. I'm a lawyer, but it's still not 100% clear. And we have the clear evidence of the consulate, but there are other issues we would like to get into where we have actual schools. Like there's one school, what's the name of it now? Because in Toronto that has a list of 100 people who from that school who served in the IDF. And this kind of work has to be done very carefully. And as everything we do, I'm a lawyer, okay? You got to be right. You got to do it right. And so we have to work on that. And I won't say more than that.
So John just spoke to the like the legal angle, and he's the lawyer. But I want to say that beyond that, I think there's a lot that we Jews need to do. We need to take responsibility for our own community and our own like moral stand. And what is the right thing for our Jewish federations to support with, let's say, charity dollars? What should our Jewish schools be teaching? What's actually a responsible way to raise Jewish children in the world today? So that's the point of view that I want to express for Jewish people that are on this call right now. I think we need to raise this within our own community. So it's not something that just simply goes on as a kind of just unexamined, unquestioned part of Jewish education. And it makes it difficult, it makes it complex. Any of us who raise this will be subjected to very severe criticism, ostracization, all this. I imagine most of us on this call have already experienced that. You know what I'm talking about. But this is a beginning to talk about it and make it controversial, so it can't simply go on without anybody even thinking that there's a problem here.
So we may have time for perhaps 3 more questions. One is addressed to both of you. One is for John and one is for David. I'll read out all 3 and then I can repeat them again as we come to them. So the first question for John, it refers to what Ruba Ghazal shared, that the Justice Minister does not need to refer the case to the RCMP, but could act himself. That's what she said. And the question is, if that's the case, then what would be necessary for the Justice Minister to move forward to ensure that the Canadian law is upheld? So that's the question for John. The question for David is, I'm curious if Rabbi David Mivasair would be willing to share how his perspective on the Israeli occupation is informed by Jewish spiritual values, if at all. And then the question for both of you is sort of an international question regarding how just last week a British national recruit shot and killed a young 17-year-old Palestinian in the West Bank. And the question is, what advice would those involved in this campaign have for those in other countries who may wish to consider a complaint and a campaign that's similar to that which is happening in Canada? So first, I'll turn it to John to discuss the question about what Ruba Ghazal had mentioned. What is necessary for the Justice Minister to move forward if he need not refer to the RCMP?
You're asking a question where it's a problem of political will. In other words, in normal life, with normal criminality, the Justice Minister doesn't initiate prosecutions. The RCMP looks into it, or the different police forces look into it, and then they gather evidence, and then they go to a prosecutor, and the prosecutor lays charges, and the minister is independent. But when there's a big crisis like this, I consider this a major crisis, or if there were a bigger crisis, it's clear that the Minister of Justice would act and invite the RCMP to act, or to invite another police force to act, depending on the nature of the crime involved. So it's a political question, And this is why we're looking at, we've done a tremendous campaign to get the RCMP to act. I haven't seen them acting, but they may be doing something. We may have to take what's called a private complaint, where if the police don't do it and David and I have a fight and I go to a judge and say, David hit me, I'm sorry, but that's how we're talking about it. And the judge would could authorize the complaint. So we'll have to talk about this, but it comes down to a political question. And this is where the plea and the challenge of our solidarity work is to try and have Canada change its foreign policy, just a little bit for now. Remember, Canada was rejected by the world community. So let's not Canadians think that they are superior, that they are defenders of human rights. Canadian policy does not defend human rights. And we should know that and have that clear in our minds. Thank you very much. I haven't answered your question, I don't think, but.
I think that is an answer to the question, and sometimes we can't know these things in absolute terms. Now I'll turn it to Rabbi David on the question about how your perspective on the Israeli occupation is informed by your spiritual values as a person and as a rabbi, etc.
Great. Well, that is a great question. And part of spiritual values, I think, is to recognize the inherent holiness of every person and the equality of all people. And that land should not be like divided, and that we are called upon to seek justice. These are such fundamental spiritual values. I feel foolish even like talking about it. Why does this even need to be talked about? Isn't this clear to everyone? And of course, you don't need to be Jewish to think this. Every person on earth should think this. It gets complicated when it gets mixed up in a story about history and the emphasis on Jewish suffering, the reality of Jewish powerlessness, victimization. And let's not forget that even, I would say during the lifetime of my parents, millions and millions of Jews were killed on an industrial scale, millions, So in the aftermath of that, there's a kind of a reaction that I don't think is justifying what's going on in any way, but I'm making a point that it makes it more complex than something that I can just say, oh, my spiritual values are everyone's equal. My spiritual values are, of course, we should share everything. My spiritual values are actually, I want to share with everyone. Like, these are beautiful things to believe and to feel and to say. And that is what motivates me. And that's what makes me do what I do and how I got here, why I'm here talking with you right now, of course. But I'm saying that obviously there's deep complications, complexities, and it's not such a simple thing. And I'll just say unequivocally, what you call the occupation of the West Bank is absolutely wrong in every way. And it's not only the occupation of the West Bank, it's the occupation of all of Palestine, right? There's really no real difference at all between what's being done in what we call the Galilee or what we call the Negev and what's being done, outside of Ramallah or Nablus. And I'll go even a step farther. If you want to talk about occupation, I think Judaism has been occupied by Zionism. So it's become actually difficult for us Jews to even talk about this. And I'm not saying we shouldn't try, but I am trying to just give a sense of the complexity and difficulty of the whole thing.
I am seeing a lot of questions and comments from the audience that specifically are saying this is such a difficult conversation to have, and talking about layers of trauma and intergenerational trauma on behalf of Palestinians, on behalf of Jews, and appreciate all of these comments and questions that are coming in that do note the complexities of this issue and of the broader context that every question has come back around to. We have just a few minutes left, so I'll bring us back to the final question. Given the news story this past week about the first, I believe it was the first child in Palestine who was shot and killed in the West Bank, and the discovery that it was a British national recruit who had done so. Again, the question is, what advice might our campaign have for those in other countries who may want to consider doing something similar? Essentially recognizing this is not just a Canadian issue, what can others do? I'll hand it first to John Philpot and then back to Rabbi David Mivasair. And then if Jonathan Katab would like to answer to this or any of the previous questions as well, I'll give him the floor as well.
Well, Great Britain has some similar legislation, and this man, I don't know whether they can charge him or not in British law. I don't know British law. There's something about Nevson Resources, the Supreme Court, has opened the door to suing in Canada for crimes committed abroad by certain people. I don't believe necessarily in legal recourse, but this can be a deterrent, as is the ICC, which has done a bad job on many, many things, but seems to be trying to get somewhere on the Palestinian question, the occupation. I met with the deputy prosecutor about this about 7-8 years ago. I went and asked them about it, and they were humming and hawing. I'll leave it at that. I'll leave it at that and pass it to my learned colleagues.
I think legally, of course, it depends on the legal system in other countries, but I think people everywhere can mobilize around moral issues. And as I said before about us in the Jewish community in Canada, I think Jews in other countries should mobilize around this. I think we have a responsibility to take a moral stance and to say this is not something we should be educating our children about. I could even use the word indoctrinating them. You know, if we're going to talk about Israel, we need to be realistic about it and give them the complex, complicated, difficult view of it, and not make it like what sometimes we call Disneyland East. You know, they can all get dressed up in army uniforms and act like heroes. It's not that simple. Anyway, I'm just saying, in other countries, I think everyone could try to heighten the issue, make it a controversy, make it difficult to just go ahead and continue. And I think Jews especially have a responsibility to do that.
Maybe on that note, I will highlight another bit of news from the past week, in case those have missed it, which were that activists in England just on Monday actually shut down an arms factory that's owned by Israel's largest arms firm, Elbit Systems, as an act of solidarity, and successfully did shut down the arms factory for the entire day. And just to continue on the theme of international connections, Canada has in fact just in December awarded Elbit a $36 million contract for a civilian version of the drones that Israel used to kill Palestinians in Gaza, most notably in 2014. So these are, of course, both issues of national law and of struggles in particular places, but of course, as we know, deeply interconnected. The violence it crosses borders, and our solidarity obviously must as well. Jonathan Katab, I wanted to give you a chance to say any final words to these questions before we wrap up.
Yes, I recognize the complexity that sometimes appears to be in this situation. And I also applaud those who attempt through empathy, understanding the other side, putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, applying versions of the golden rule, treating others as you wish to be treated. The moral and the ethical basis helps us a lot through the complexity, as does international law and human rights, precisely by positing universal rules that you are willing to apply to everybody, your own people as well as the other people. If torture is evil, it's evil, regardless of whether it's our people, our friends who are doing it, and regardless of who's the victim, if he's a bad guy or a nasty guy. Torture is wrong still. So law and human rights provides us with one yardstick, and the other, as I said, is morality, decency, and solidarity across all lines. When there was at one time the hope after World War II that the nations of the world had given up on war, wanted to improve and strengthen international institutions, and wanted to reduce the possibility of use of violence. So the United Nations was created, and its different organs and different conventions were passed. Unfortunately, chauvinism and nationalism and power asserted itself again and tried to weaken this sense of international solidarity, which is where civil society comes back into the picture, which is where decent people all over the world from different countries show solidarity with others who are suffering, who are being oppressed, whose rights are being taken away from them. One of the reasons why BDS is so useful a tool is precisely because it is nonviolent, and precisely because it calls on ordinary people to show solidarity along the lines of international law, along the lines of human rights, in support of minimal, specific political goals that people should agree on: ending the occupation, providing for the right of return, working for full equality for citizens of Israel. It's a very, very minimal political platform. The beauty of it is it's international solidarity that is nonviolent. And maybe this is also an answer to those who asked, what should we do? What should we do? Yes, it is complex, but there are specific things that can be done and that are done in solidarity, in support of legitimate causes, in support of human rights and international law, and above all, non-violently.
Thank you so much, Jonathan Katab. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today and to everyone who joined us. We received many, I don't have the final number, but many dozen of questions, and I really regret that we could not get to all of them because they were very interesting. Yes, Rabbi David, I'll hand it to you for a second before I wrap up.
Exactly what you're saying. There's so many questions, so many good comments, information being shared. I want to encourage everyone to join Just Peace Advocates or one of the other organizations. If you want to support the Jewish voice here, you can join or support independent Jewish voices and continue this conversation and hopefully join together in, doing more about this and so many other things. So we don't want to just leave it with all the questions hanging there. There's no way we could get to them right here, right now, but let's stick together and share this, as we go forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. To our educators, who are organizers, it's very hard to leave a conversation in the middle when so many interesting points have been raised. But yes, I do want to thank the hosts of this event, and these are organizations that do continue this work and where we can continue this conversation. So Just Peace Advocates, Palestinian and Jewish Unity, Canadian Foreign Policy Institute, World Beyond War, and then of course the organizations of the speakers, as David mentioned. And then we do list on the website all of the 50 plus organizations who endorsed from across Canada and around the world. We are part of many bigger movements where this work can and will continue. Big thank you to our fabulous interpreters, Antonio Artuzo and Peter Feldstein. Your work is important and we appreciate it. As an immediate next step, I know that in the chat and in the comments, links have been shared, and we'll send them as a follow-up email to this event as well about how you can send a letter right now to Minister Lametti, to the RCMP Commissioner that also CCs Minister Lametti, letting them know that you care about this issue and you expect them to take action. If you've already sent a letter, a great thing to do is to resend it, this time asking why you have not yet received a response. We will share these links and these comments and these ways of taking action after. But for now, I want to say thank you again. It's been an excellent evening and discussion about an important issue with all of you. So I want to say thank you and good night.